Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Sebastian Wolf came home to the familiar whine of his dogs after another long day at work. They always acted like they hadn't seen him in ages. He held his hands out to them, which they showered in kisses. "Easy, easy," he told them, as they tried to push past his hands and get into his face. Sebastian was debating if it was a drinking night or not. He had to work the next day, and it was only Tuesday, but some days the bottle called louder than others and wouldn't be ignored. A jogger in gray trainers came down the sidewalk. Once upon a time, Sebastian would try waving and bidding the stranger a good evening. It barely occurred to him anymore. Living among the English had proven to be like living in a desert compared to where he had come from. His heritage was rooted in two cultures that were very social by tradition: Argentinian and Chilean. A few career decisions and unforeseen life events later, he ended up in Sussex, England, where faces didn't smile, eyes didn't meet, laughter was dry and sarcastic, and the obituaries may as well have been the funnies. This hadn't been easy for Sebastian. Back where he was from, no matter how the day went, you at least had the warmth of family and good neighbors. Sebastian was perpetually alone in Sussex. He was an army of one in the workplace, and he had no one to knock back a drink with at the end of the day. He could tell his dogs anything he wanted to, but, at least he didn't have to be lonely in squalor. The flat he rented was rather posh, as his neighbors would say, if they would say anything to him at all. He studied himself in an ivory-rimmed bathroom mirror. His 5 o'clock shadow wasn't as dark as it used to be in certain places. Gray was peppered abundantly along his chin. He almost thought that some of the color in his eyes had faded, if brown could fade. 41, he muttered to himself. He could remember looking in the mirror and saying things like 25 and 30. Those moments felt like forever ago. The bottle won. He poured an expensive whiskey into a tumbler that looked like it had been cut like a gemstone. He sat out on his rooftop deck and would watch to see if the dying daylight would make a sunset worth seeing. He was rewarded. The sky was painted fiery colors, and seagulls piped and drifted among the houses, looking for handouts. Sebastian eyed the old ladies and others that came onto their own rooftop to feed the scavenging gulls. They could socialize with the birds, but not with each other, he noted. Had Sussex been any of the number of places he had lived with his parents? The rooftops would have been crowded with smiling, jovial people, draining the whiskey bottle dry and laughing so loudly that the seagulls would be frightened away. But not here. People occupied their own personal spaces that nobody left and nobody visited. Before long, Sebastian began to notice that someone was observing him. Not just once, but several times spanning several evenings. He was sharp of eyes, unlike most people he ran into. He partially questioned why this turn of neighborly behavior bothered him. He had been distantly hoping for some level of interaction with others, but perhaps this was too forward without a proper introduction. Still, the man with the small mustache and the sloppy comb-over stood in front of Sebastian's yard, just beyond his turf, and stared. The days that this occurred became weeks. One evening, Sebastian had enough. His observer hadn't missed a day for 2 weeks straight, and it was time for an introduction before he decided to either ask the man out for a drink or strike him across the jaw and stomp his head into the pavement. His visitor seemed wary and perhaps even a bit surprised to see Sebastian approach him. "Can I help you?" Sebastian said, clad in a burgundy bathrobe with slippers to match. "You acknowledge my presence," the man stated. a thick German accent carrying the words. This prompted Sebastian to smile and nod. "Oh, no wonder you're not like everyone else. You're not a tea-sucking, crumpet-shitting local," Sebastian remarked, a bit under the influence. This made the stranger smirk. "Oh, no wonder you're always alone. You're not tainted," he said. The words didn't even register in Sebastian's senses. His brain felt like it was getting a breath of fresh air with someone to actually talk to. "Care for a drink?" "Gladly," the stranger said. And just like that, in a dry desert of fellowship and social fulfillment, the two men found an oasis in the other's company. They knew nothing about each other, but they sat back on Sebastian's patio furniture on his rooftop and talked and laughed as the clouds turned pink and the horizon turned gold. As the amber whiskey flowed, both men volunteered more information about themselves. Sebastian spoke of the way he meandered from his homeland to Sussex, where he hated to be but never quite got up the gumption to make concrete plans to leave, and he wasn't sure why. Anton told a very outlandish tale of growing up in an orphanage in Austria, where his classmates exiled him for being the hidden son of Adolf Hitler. He didn't really know if that's who he was. It was just the license that the other kids used to either alienate him or brutalize him. Amidst so many beatings, he would protest, "You're not respectful of my rights," to which his assailants would respond, "We're not Adolf Hitler's son." He thus found himself where he was, 46 years old and perfectly isolated from society as he knew it, until that very moment where he was having a blast with his fellow alcoholic. The morning found both men sleeping in late and hungover. Sebastian could now look at his visitor's face for the first time with focused eyes. It wasn't a far-fetched notion that he was the progeny of the late Führer. If the mustache had been chopped an inch on either side, he would look just like his supposed father. But what were the odds, really? Sebastian made a mediocre breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, and extended the absurd social engagement with the stranger, claiming to be a war criminal's son. "So, what brings the son of Hitler to a gaping vat of anus like Sussex?" Sebastian asked while shoveling eggs into his mouth. "Hiding, mostly. My father was not a likable man, so I do not want to merely waltz back into my homeland announcing who he was. But if I go back home as a stranger, life would be a challenge. So I remain where I am, where my roots run deep enough to keep me alive." Sebastian poured some whiskey in his coffee. He held it up and shook the bottle, raising his eyebrows. "Well, of course," Anton said with flourish. The truth potion filled both men again until Anton got up and stumbled over his leather bag. He drew out a stethoscope, an exceptionally well-made one. He pressed the end of it to Sebastian's chest and smiled as he heard a healthy, steady tick in his chest. "Mr. Wolf, I will show you something that will blow your understanding of the world. Before I do that, I need you to listen to my heart." Sebastian was just a few sips away from cross-eyed status again when he agreed. The world went quiet as the stethoscope plugged his ears. The business end rested against Anton's chest, and his heart announced its presence loud and clear. Anton took the device back and beckoned. "Follow me." The two men bumbled their way onto the sidewalk where the occasional pedestrian wandered by. Anton fearlessly seized the first one he saw, a man of about 60 years of age out for a jog. "My friend, would you be a peach and let me listen to your heartbeat?" Anton said rather mushily. The frowning Englishman looked Anton up and down but didn't see any reason to object. Anton put the diaphragm of the stethoscope against the stranger's chest and smiled. He leered at Sebastian. "Have a listen, no?" he said, holding out the headset. Sebastian fumbled the ear tips until he had them in, and he waited. And waited. And waited. "Anton, I don't hear anything," he said. Anton just smiled. The stranger's eyes rapidly ticked back and forth between the two drunks. "Thank you for your time, sir," Anton said to the jogger, dismissing him. Sebastian was sobering up just enough to think critically. What the hell was that? I didn't hear anything at all. That's the point, Anton replied rather smugly. Your neighbors behave heartlessly, for that's exactly what they are. Sebastian and Anton slept most of the afternoon and the evening. Sebastian was plagued by strange dreams of being in public, the grocery store, the gas station, the park, all places populated by people that had gaping black voids in their chests. Black holes that were perfect pits of silence and absence, heartless, soulless. They drank tea through their mouths only for the hot liquid to spill out of their chests and eat holes in the floor or dissolve the flowers and grass on the ground. Sebastian was the first one to wake up. It was almost dark outside. He felt like he could sleep another 12 hours. He first made sure his guest was all right. The spitting image of Hitler was snuggling up to a long pillow on the couch and snoring. He was all right. Sebastian looked at him for a long moment. The two men had exchanged many secrets and much personal information, but had been too soggy to absorb all of it. They might as well have been alone and talking to themselves. Be that as it may, Sebastian was happy to have Anton's company. His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of struggling coming from the front lawn. Sebastian came outside in time to see his dogs ganging up on a stranger holding a crowbar. The dogs had been faster than the stranger, and the blunt weapon fell to the grass harmlessly. The dogs made quick work of the stranger, who bled out onto the turf when his throat was ripped out. Sebastian speechlessly approached the slain body with a steaming hole in its throat. He about wet himself when something the size of a cat wormed its way up from inside the body's chest and emerged through the wound. A squealing, squirming, clawing mockery of life. Something like an overgrown bat crossed with an inbred monkey. One of the dogs seized it and shook it until its neck snapped. The whole pack set to devouring the small monster. Sebastian fainted. I suppose it's my turn to make breakfast? Anton said with a smile. Sebastian was lying on the floor as his senses spoke to him one by one. He clutched his pounding head, unable to tell if his plight was due to alcohol or psychological trauma. My dogs, they made doggy kibble out of a foolish trespasser? Yes? Sebastian needed another drink but didn't have the heart to pour one. Jesus, Anton. Something crawled out of the body and it wasn't natural. We need to call the police. We need to notify someone. They won't come for the dog food. They will come for you. I know their true nature, and so they follow me around. I got tipsy and I showed you their true nature. So, now they follow you around, just as they follow me. Sebastian stared at him for a long moment. Who are you? And what have you just gotten me into? I am the truth, and you are not ready for me yet, Anton said with a chuckle. But no matter. The truth came for your head, and it will do it again now that you're associated with me. Sebastian held up his hands as if that would clear his head up faster. Whoa. Give it to me straight and clear. Why am I suddenly a wanted man by people with no heartbeat and little demons living in their bodies? You'll notice how the English are cold and distant, right? They have no humor, no sympathy. They have no heartbeat. They have no individual mind. I have been studying why for many years and arrived at many dead ends. When I am nearing a breakthrough, they find me and drive me away. He gestured to Sebastian. They must think you are my partner in perceived crime. For they attack you in the same way they attack me all my years, trying to help. This is crazy, Sebastian yelled. This is reality, Anton countered. Perhaps you help me find a cure. Find a release for the Englishmen, so they do not give birth to little demon babies. Yeah, sure, Sebastian said, still not sure what he was agreeing to. Now you're hunted, and you must not be out after dark if you can help it, Anton warned. Now I will need to get back to work. I must return to my home and get my computer and notes. We work quickly together. Please stay here while I get tools. Sebastian forgot about his agreement just as soon as he had made it. His mind and his body were begging for some kind of release, some kind of escape and suspension of the stress and the tension. He stretched in front of his home and took off a little faster than he should have for not stopping to warm up. The stress was at critical mass and threatened to explode out of him in some shape or fashion. Premature exertion was the healthiest outlet he had at the time. He felt much better sooner than he thought he would. The birdsong filled his ears along with the murmur of the wind in the tree. There were still flowers in people's yards, and there were still lovely girls out for walks with their dogs, however much they may or may not have lacked a pulse. Between the change of scenery and the endorphins that were starting to flow steadily into his veins, he almost convinced himself that Anton, the English, and the silence through the stethoscope were all just a bad dream. The sun began to set, and the richness of the colors flowed through his eyes and cleansed the plaque of darkness from his soul. He had to keep running. He had to keep putting distance between himself and Anton, and the reality he was trying to show him. A horrible, impossible reality that raises questions that would bring madness with the answers. He had to keep plunging into this reality of sunsets and cool, fragrant breezes. He was schooled in reality once more when a great flapping noise blew the air around him and whooshed into his ears. Something sharp ripped a huge gash into his sweatshirt. His first thought was that a crazed hawk or something had attacked him. Perhaps he was in the vicinity of a nest. He got a view of the back of the thing as it flew up and away to circle back and make another dive. It wasn't a bird. Far from it. Birds didn't have a wingspan that ridiculous, nor did birds have arms with claws as wicked as the ones on their toes. Birds also didn't have small, round, and bald heads with glowing yellow eyes and pointed demonic ears. Birds didn't have long tails that ended in points as sharp as arrows. The creature circled back around and dove straight for Sebastian's face. If Sebastian wasn't questioning his sanity earlier, he definitely was then in that moment. The creature opened its feet like a raptor and also swiped with its hands. It raked him across his temple with 3 crimson lines that began bleeding ribbons of red. It stung something fierce. The pain was cold. He opened his eyes just in time to see 3 more creatures of similar appearance coming out of the sky to pay him a visit. He became fearful. One of those little guys might just be a nuisance, but 4 of them could probably tear him apart, like an attack by feral dogs with wings. He protected his face by ducking his head down between his elbows and wrapping his hands behind his head, at the price of offering his back to the monsters. It offered little to no protection against every pair of serrated talons that swooped down at him. The claws were cold, and his blood flowed warm. Then a horn honked nearby, and someone yelled at him in German. It was Anton. He had driven out to find Sebastian when he didn't come home before darkness fell. Sebastian feebly held out his hands against the claws and the beating wings and sprang into the open door of Sebastian's truck. "You don't listen very well," Anton chided. Sebastian didn't say anything other than quietly grunted. "Thanks." "So, you've gotten us into a lot of trouble and revealed an important clue at the same time," Anton said. "Very good work, Mr. English hater." Sebastian was too shaken up to say anything good or bad. His world was falling apart. What was he thinking? This wasn't his world. This world, where he was a prisoner against his will? This was someone else's world, and he felt like an unwanted dog that had been staked to the back of the yard and forgotten about. And now, the family that owned the yard was in a rainbow of disarray. It was disconcerting no matter how you sliced it. Then, his heart seized up when he saw 2 gargoyles, just like the ones that attacked him, sitting on stone pedestals, guarding the gate to a cemetery. They didn't stir. Then they drove by a church, and he saw more there. They kind of stuck out since they weren't quite like anything he could remember seeing in any other architecture. The sight gave him palpitations, but they remained where they were. The 2 men made it back to Sebastian's place. Sebastian was hitting the bottle. Anton was hitting the books. Sebastian was doing his best to come to terms with what he saw and experienced, and the implications of them. So he was mauled by creatures that were in the background of his everyday life for years. How long had they been watching him? Were they all gargoyles like this? Were they somehow parasitizing the populace like large stone botflies, using living human bodies as incubators? The silence was punctuated by Anton turning pages in his books and keying things into his laptop. He didn't know he had fallen asleep until Anton shook him awake. "Mr. English hater?" Anton said, looking at him from over his glasses like an old man. "I have something I think you will find interesting." Sebastian sat up reluctantly, not wanting to look at anything. "The internet is God's gift to man these days. Minus all the bondage and torture porn, yeah?" Sebastian didn't so much as flinch in response. "I found here a website run by a man who is obsessed with gargoyle sculptures and memorial carvings around the world. Here are complete catalogs and photographs of all sorts of stone beasties. Now, I would like you to tell me if anything you see looks familiar, even remotely similar to the beasties that decided to interrupt your evening jog that I had advised against." Sebastian eyed his companion with a burning look as he took the laptop. He should have known that he wasn't going to get to go back to his booze-induced nap anytime soon. It was, after all, an entire world's worth of centuries of sculpture. Photographs of pieces still standing in existence. Illustrations from crumbling books of monuments that were ground to sand by the passage of time centuries ago. Sebastian was losing his patience after about an hour and a half. He had figured out the keyboard shortcuts on Anton's laptop and was cycling through photos as fast as the machine would load them on Internet Explorer running on Windows XP. Anton knew the answer before Sebastian finally set the laptop down and threw his hands up in frustration. "No such thing, eh?" he said, smiling. "Nothing. Not one of those pictures came close. Makes you think there's a possibility there could be something other than gargoyles. The cuckoo bird in humanity's nest. Sneakily hiding in plain sight, yeah?" Sebastian could feel everything he had just been trying to drink away come back in a hurry like a surging wave of nausea. This is too crazy. Way too crazy. He threw one hand against his scalp before standing up, shaking his head and pacing in a circle. "So, unless we're sharing the same hallucination, you're selling me on the idea that there are creatures that are posing as gargoyles by hiding next to real gargoyles?" "This is close enough for where we are now, I suppose." "So, are you planning on seeing if these things can be killed? The way things have gone so far, you're probably going to propose that we liberate all of England and hunt down every pseudo-gargoyle we can find." "I actually wasn't thinking quite along those lines, but you propose an interesting idea," Anton said. No, I didn't actually mean..." "You make a good case. We will need to defend ourselves from the fully grown stone demons, if not from the people all around us. So it would be wise to make sure that these creatures can even be brought down. For all we know, they don't bleed like us. They look like stone. Perhaps their entire biology is stone-based, whereas we are flesh-based. I have a good hunting rifle that we can use to snipe at some of our rock-faced little munchkins, eh? And so the two men sat in Anton's truck outside the gates to a cemetery they had passed earlier. The gate was black and imposing. The gargoyles that were perched atop the two stone pillars were probably black at one point in time, but the elements had flecked them with gray and green. The thing was, these gargoyles were similar to the ones that had ambushed Sebastian, so their disguise was nearly perfect. Sebastian doubted his own senses in the matter. These creatures looked every bit like they should have been original sculptures, not creatures that were part of some strange conspiracy cooked up by the lost son of Hitler. Anton drummed his palms on the steering wheel. So we have been here a long time, and no motion from our little friends. Sebastian nodded. Shoot one? What? Shoot one of them. See what happens. Sebastian shrugged. What did he have to lose? He made sure that a cartridge was chambered before taking aim at one of the two gargoyles. He felt a twang of conscience, like he was 16 and holding a spray can to a brick wall of a public building for the first time. Defacing other people's property was not his thing. He pulled the trigger. He expected a spray of concrete or stone or whatever. That isn't what happened. There was blood. A cloud of it. The gargoyle whimpered as it fell over with a shattered eggshell of a cranium and face planted in the turf just in front of its pillar. Sebastian delayed for half a second before he chambered another round and fired at the other gargoyle that was just beginning to react to the reality of its fallen comrade. The cartridge punctured its chest and exploded out of its back. It fell backwards into the cemetery, where it floundered for a few moments before going still. Anton leapt out of the truck and raced over to pick up the body of the first gargoyle. His movements indicated that it was every bit as heavy as it would have been if it were a stone sculpture. Englishmen started appearing over the hillside. "For science!" Anton said, as he hauled the bulk of the dead thing into the back of the truck. Sebastian felt the back of the truck sink low. By the time they got moving, the roadside was starting to teem with people. "We might not get to take the next semester of Mad Scientist 101, Sebastian said, as every vehicle in a 100-mile radius began to stop and turn towards them. A small sports car sped towards the truck as if it were a kamikaze fighter plane. It wiped out against a tree at a skewered angle to where Anton was. "We just might have to skip town entirely, Mr. Wolf. Not without my dogs." "You've got to be shitting me. Dog shitting me. My dogs are my family. I can't just leave my family behind," Sebastian wailed. Anton rolled his eyes and dodged 3 oncoming cars as he tried to pick a route to Sebastian's apartment. It wasn't going to be easy. As if it hadn't been clear before that the English were under the control of a single hive mind, it was morbidly evident that the entire whole of the city was converging on them. Sebastian wasn't sure if it was his imagination or what, but he swore he heard distinct sounds coming from all around him. The first was a throbbing that filled the air, and even rattled the windows of the vehicle they were in. It couldn't have been. And yet, the signature rhythm was there. A heartbeat. The more the streets filled with pedestrians that gave chase on foot, the more the second sound became clear. The whole lot of them, every man, woman, and child that appeared, were chanting in unison. "Jolly good. Jolly good. Jolly good." The voices were layered, made up of thousands, but they spoke in perfect unison. Sebastian craned his neck to look skyward. They were up there, circling like large stone vultures. The overlords. The parasites. The gargoyles, if that's what they were even called. Sebastian had never been more grateful that he lived at the edge of town. It meant that the whole of the masses would have to come from one general direction, and Anton had gotten ahead of them by some bizarre twist of luck. Sebastian cursed as they pulled into the driveway of his flat. His dogs had fought bravely, bringing down 4 or 5 of the possessed Englishmen, each of them with mutilated throats. But only 2 of his dogs still stood, trembling, while the others were as still as their enemies on the lawn. "Those fuckers killed my dogs!" Sebastian roared. "If you don't think proactively, the surviving pups will die as well, and us with them," said Anton. Sebastian fired off a few cartridges at gargoyles in anger, and this had an unexpected effect on the swarms of people. When a gargoyle died, the people were seized with spasms. The patrolling bodies that blocked any approach to the surviving dogs were without direction for a few seconds with each successful shot. Sebastian wasted no time in exploiting the temporary blind spot and getting his dogs into the bed of the truck. His anger sharpened his accuracy, and each swooping gargoyle got a round to the head, which made bodies dance for blocks. It allowed Anton enough time to get beyond the reach of the mob and out to an open highway. Sebastian got out his phone and took some recordings of the furious gargoyles that dotted the sky and the chanting crowds that shrank away in the distance, ceaselessly repeating their nefarious mantra, "Jolly good, jolly good, jolly good." He used the last few minutes of signal reception to post on Reddit and other social media. Pay attention to the gargoyles you pass every day, on your churches, on your gravestones, wherever they may be. Make sure you can identify them. Place them in some span of architectural history. Otherwise, you may be under their control. There may even be one growing inside of you.
Chilling tales for dark